The funeral home in Bloomington, Indiana, ran out of chairs by 10 a.m., and they hadn't even opened the doors yet. Detective Marcus Chen, who'd been assigned traffic control for what was supposed to be a routine veteran's funeral, counted over 400 people standing in the parking lot in the February cold. For a 97-year-old retired high school history teacher who died peacefully in his sleep, this was unusual. When Chen asked the funeral director what was going on, the man just shook his head and said, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." Robert Allen King had died on February 2, 2019. The obituary in the Bloomington Herald-Times was brief. Robert A. King, 97, longtime educator at Bloomington High School South, passed away peacefully, survived by 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 12 great-grandchildren. Veteran of World War II, 2nd Infantry Division. Memorial service Friday at 11 a.m. Standard stuff. Nothing to explain why there were now over 500 people crowding into a funeral home designed for 200. Chen stood near the entrance, watching people arrive. Most were elderly, men in their 80s and 90s, some in wheelchairs, many wearing faded military caps with unit patches. But there were younger people too, middle-aged men and women, teenagers, whole families. A guy showed up from Texas wearing a 2nd Infantry Division patch and carrying a worn photograph. A woman drove from Michigan with her 89-year-old father, who could barely walk but insisted on coming. They kept saying the same thing. "Lieutenant King remembered me." The service was supposed to start at 11. By 10:45, there were over 600 people, and the funeral director was having a panic attack about fire code violations. They moved it to the Presbyterian church across the street, which had a sanctuary that could hold 800. By 11, that was full too. They set up speakers in the fellowship hall. People stood in the hallways. Some stood outside in the cold, listening through the open doors. Chen, who was supposed to be directing traffic, found himself standing in the back of the sanctuary, listening. This was his day off. He'd just been asked to help with parking because the department was short-staffed, but now he wanted to understand. Who was Robert King, and why were all these people here? The eulogy was given by a 74-year-old man named Thomas Breslin, who introduced himself as the son of Private First Class James Breslin, E Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division. His voice shook as he spoke. "My father died in 1987, Breslin said. "I was 42 years old. Before he died, he told me a story. He said that in June of 1944, when he was 19 years old and scared out of his mind, waiting to go ashore at Normandy, a young lieutenant came up to him on the transport ship. My dad had never met this officer before. They'd been assigned to the same company just 3 days earlier in England. The lieutenant walked right up to my father, stuck out his hand, and said, 'Private Breslin, right? From Dubuque, Iowa. Your dad's a railroad conductor on the Chicago and Northwestern. You've got 2 sisters, Margaret, who's a nurse, and Ellen, who just got engaged to a Marine. You worked at the John Deere plant before you enlisted. You're probably wondering how the hell I know all that.' My father was stunned. The lieutenant smiled and said, 'I remember people, Breslin, all people. And I'm going to remember you. That's my job, to remember every single one of you, and to get you home to your families.' My father said that moment changed everything for him. He wasn't just another soldier anymore. He was James Breslin from Dubuque, and his lieutenant knew who he was, knew his family, knew his life. And my father followed that man through France and Belgium and Germany, through battles that killed half their company, because he knew that Lieutenant King actually cared about bringing James Breslin home." Breslin paused, wiping his eyes. "That's who Robert King was. He remembered everyone, not just names. He remembered families, hometowns, jobs, dreams, fears, all of it. And he carried those memories through the war and brought them home with him. When my father died, Lieutenant King, who was Mr. King by then, retired history teacher, drove 300 miles to the funeral. He found me and said, "You must be Tom. Your father talked about you constantly, said you were going to be a lawyer. Did you make it?" And I had. I was a lawyer. And somehow, 35 years after the war ended, Robert King still remembered that about my father's son, who he'd never even met. The sanctuary was silent, except for the sound of people crying. Another man stood up. Gary Morrison, age 79. My uncle was in Lieutenant King's company, Sergeant Paul Morrison from Cincinnati. He was killed at the Siegfried Line in September 1944. My mother, his sister, never really recovered from losing him. When I was 14, in 1954, Mr. King found out I lived in Bloomington and came to our house. He sat with my mother for 3 hours and told her stories about Paul. Told her how Paul talked about her all the time, how he'd promised to take her to see New York after the war, how he'd carried her photo through every battle. My mother cried harder than I'd ever seen, but afterward, she said it was the first time since 1944 that she'd felt like someone else understood what she'd lost, because Mr. King remembered Paul. Not as a casualty number, but as a person. My mother kept in touch with Mr. King until she died in 1989. He came to her funeral, too. A woman in her 60s stood next. I'm Susan Kowalski. My grandfather, Stephen Kowalski, served under Lieutenant King. He died before I was born in 1963. But when I was in college at Indiana University in the 1970s, Mr. King was teaching at the high school. Someone told him I was Stephen Kowalski's granddaughter. He called me, asked if we could talk. I met him at a coffee shop, and he spent 2 hours telling me about my grandfather. He remembered that my grandfather was from Pittsburgh, worked in a steel mill, had 3 daughters, loved the pirates, made the best kielbasa in the company, once carried a wounded man 2 miles through German fire. He had stories I'd never heard, details my own grandmother had forgotten. And he remembered all of it because, he said, I made it my job to know your grandfather, to know all of them. It changed my life. I'd always felt like I'd lost something by not knowing my grandfather. But after talking to Mr. King, I felt like I knew him. Like he was real to me in a way he'd never been before. The stories kept coming. Sons and daughters and grandchildren of men who'd served under Lieutenant King. People he'd taught at Bloomington High School South, where he'd worked for 34 years. Students he'd had in class who said he still remembered their names and something personal about them decades later. A man who'd been in his history class in 1968 stood up and said, "On the first day of class, Mr. King handed out index cards and asked us to write our names, where we were from, something about our families, and one thing we were interested in." There were 32 students in that class. By the 3rd day, he'd memorized all of our cards. He never needed to look at a seating chart, never confused names, and he'd use what we'd written to connect history to our lives. When we studied World War II, and of course we studied it, Mr. King had been there. He'd say things like, "Patterson, your grandfather worked at the Ford plant in Detroit, right? They built B-24 bombers there, Liberators. Your grandfather probably helped build planes that flew missions I saw in France." He made it personal. He made us all feel seen, just like he'd done with his soldiers in 1944. Chen stood in the back, taking notes without really knowing why. This was his day off. He was supposed to be directing parking, but he kept writing down names, details, trying to understand how one man could have touched so many lives just by remembering them. After the service, Chen approached Breslin, who was accepting condolences from a line of people. "Excuse me, sir, I'm Detective Marcus Chen, Bloomington PD. I'm not here officially, I was just helping with traffic, but I have to ask, how did Lieutenant King remember all those people? That's not normal, that's not something most people can do." Breslin looked at him with tired red eyes. "No, it's not normal. Lieutenant King had what they'd probably call photographic memory today, though I don't think they called it that in the 1940s. He told my father once that he'd always been able to remember faces and details. Started when he was a kid. He'd meet someone once and remember everything about the conversation. Names, dates, details. He said it was like his brain took a snapshot and filed it away. He couldn't forget things even if he tried. That must have been useful in the war," Chen said. "Useful?" Breslin laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "It saved lives, Detective, let me tell you about that." They sat down in the fellowship hall, and Breslin told Chen the story that would keep the detective awake for the next 3 nights. Robert Allen King was born on April 3, 1921, in Terre Haute, Indiana. His father ran a hardware store. His mother was a schoolteacher. Robert was the middle of 3 children, and from an early age his parents noticed something unusual about him. He remembered everything. Not just important things, everything. At age 5, he could recite entire conversations from weeks ago. At age 7, he could tell you the name of every kid in his school and something personal about each of them. At age 10, he'd read a book once and could quote passages from memory months later. His parents thought maybe he was a genius. They had him tested. The results were interesting. Robert's overall intelligence was above average, but not extraordinary. His memory, however, was off the charts. The psychologist who tested him said Robert had what he called hyperthymesia, the ability to remember vast amounts of personal experiences and details from his own life, combined with an exceptional memory for faces and associated information. Robert could meet someone once, have a 5-minute conversation, and remember that person's name, appearance, and everything they'd discussed for years afterward. It was a gift that made him popular. He was the kid who never forgot your birthday, who always remembered the name of your dog, who could recall stories you'd told him months ago. People liked Robert King because he made them feel important. He paid attention in a way most people didn't. When the war came, Robert was 20 years old and in his 3rd year at Indiana State Teachers College, studying to be a history teacher like his mother. He enlisted in January 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. The Army gave him a battery of tests and decided to send him to officer candidate school. He graduated as a 2nd lieutenant in April 1943 and was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division. The 2nd Infantry Division, the Indian Head Division, named for its distinctive shoulder patch, was one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. They'd fought in World War I and were reactivated for World War II. By 1944, they were training in England for the invasion of France. Lieutenant Robert King joined them in May 1944, assigned as a platoon leader in E Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment. A platoon typically had about 45 men. As a platoon leader, King's job was to lead these men in combat, make tactical decisions, and keep them alive. Most platoon leaders focused on the basics: learn their sergeants' names, know who their best shots were, identify the troublemakers. King did all of that, but he also did something else. He memorized every single soldier in his platoon. Not just names, everything. Private James Breslin, age 19, from Dubuque, Iowa. Father was a railroad conductor, 2 sisters. Worked at John Deere before enlisting. Wanted to be an engineer after the war. Scared of heights, but would never admit it. made jokes when he was nervous, prayed every night, though he thought nobody saw him. Corporal Michael Torres, age 22, from El Paso, Texas. Father owned a restaurant. Torres was the oldest of 6 children. Spoke perfect Spanish and English. Had been a Golden Gloves boxer in high school. Engaged to a girl named Maria. Carried her picture in his helmet. Sang Mexican folk songs when he was homesick. Sergeant William Billy Hawkins, age 25, from Memphis, Tennessee. Career soldier. Enlisted in 1938. Father and grandfather had both served. Billy could fix any weapon, strip it blindfolded. Married, 2 kids. Wife worked at a defense plant. Billy's biggest fear was leaving his kids without a father like his own father had almost done in the Great War. King memorized all of them. 45 men. 45 full biographies. He did it by talking to each man individually, asking questions, listening to their stories. He spent the 4 weeks before D-Day getting to know his platoon, and he never forgot a single detail. The other officers thought he was crazy. "Jesus, King," one of them said. "You don't need to know their life stories. You just need to know they'll follow orders." But King's company commander, Captain James Mitchell, saw something else. Mitchell was a veteran of the North African campaign, older than most captains at 32, and he understood men. He pulled King aside one day in late May 1944. "Lieutenant, I've been watching you with your platoon. The men like you. You know why?" "Because I remember their names, sir?" "Because you remember them. Not their names, them. You make them feel like they matter as individuals, not just as rifles. That's rare, King. Most officers see soldiers as tools. Useful tools, but tools. You see them as people. Isn't that what they are, sir? People?" Mitchell smiled. "Yes. But most of us forget that under pressure. You won't. That's going to be your strength. But it's also going to be hell on you, because when you lose men, and you will lose men, Lieutenant, this is war. You're going to remember exactly who they were. Every detail, every story. You won't get to forget them. You'll carry all of them. Are you ready for that?" King had thought about it. He was 23 years old, had never seen combat, had no idea what war was really like, but he'd looked at his platoon, at Breslin and Torres and Hawkins and all the others, and he'd known that he couldn't lead men he didn't know. Couldn't order men into danger if they were just names on a roster. "I'm ready, sir." Mitchell nodded. "Good. Because we're going to need officers like you in France. Officers who remember that every casualty is somebody's son." On June 6, 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division was not part of the initial D-Day assault. They were scheduled to land on Omaha Beach on D+1, June 7th, as part of the follow-up force. King and his platoon spent June 6th aboard a transport ship, listening to radio reports of the invasion, watching the sky fill with planes, hearing the distant thunder of naval guns. That night, King couldn't sleep. He went up on deck and found Private Breslin standing at the rail, staring toward France. "Couldn't sleep either, Breslin." Breslin jumped. "Jesus, Lieutenant, you scared me." "Sorry." King leaned against the rail next to him. "You thinking about tomorrow?" "Yes, sir. Thinking about a lot of things. Thinking about my dad, about my sisters, about Iowa, about whether I'll ever see any of it again." King was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You told me once that your dad wanted you to take over his conductor route someday, the Chicago and Northwestern, Chicago to Dubuque. Is that still what you want?" Breslin looked at him in surprise. "You remember that?" "I mentioned it once, maybe 2 months ago. I remember, Breslin. And I want to know, is that still your dream?" "Because we're going to get through tomorrow, and the day after that." and all the days until this war is over. And when we do, I want you to go home and become a conductor like your dad. I want you to walk Margaret and Ellen down the aisle when they get married. I want you to have kids and tell them stories about your railroad days. That's what we're fighting for. Not just to beat the Germans, to get you home so you can live that life. Breslin's eyes were wet. You really think we'll make it, sir? I think that's my job. To remember all of you, to know all of you, and to do everything in my power to bring you home. That's my promise, Breslin, to you and to everyone in this platoon. I know who you are. I know who you're going home to, and I'm going to remember that every single day of this war. They landed on Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944. The beach was still littered with the debris of the previous day's assault, wrecked landing craft, abandoned equipment, and bodies. Lots of bodies. The fighting had moved inland, but German artillery still shelled the beach intermittently. King led his platoon off the landing craft into waist-deep water, feeling bullets snap past his head, and the only thing that kept him moving forward was the knowledge that 45 men were following him, and all of them had families and dreams and futures that depended on him making the right decisions. They made it off the beach and pushed inland. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare of hedgerow fighting in Normandy. The Germans had turned every field, every road, every farmhouse into a fortress. King's platoon took casualties. Not many at first, a man wounded here, another killed there, but each one hit King like a physical blow because he remembered them all. Private Daniel O'Connor, age 20, from Boston, killed by a sniper on June 12th. O'Connor had wanted to be a priest, had been an altar boy. His mother sent him rosary beads that he carried in his pocket. King was there when O'Connor died, watched him choke on his own blood, heard him whisper, "Hail Mary," with his last breath. King wrote to O'Connor's mother that night, a 3-page letter describing her son's courage and faith, because King remembered everything O'Connor had ever said about her. Corporal Richard Jensen, age 24, from Nebraska, lost his leg to a mine on June 18th, survived, evacuated. Jensen had been a farmer, talked constantly about his wife Sarah and their plans to expand the farm after the war. Before they loaded Jensen onto the ambulance, he grabbed King's arm and said, "Lieutenant, I'm sorry. I'm leaving you guys." King had looked him in the eye and said, "Jensen, you've done your part. You're going home to Sarah. That's what matters. You're going to have a good life, and that's why we're here. Go home. Be happy." By early July, King's platoon had lost 7 men, 2 killed, 5 wounded, badly enough to be evacuated. Statistically, that was actually low. Some platoons had lost half their strength. But every loss hit King hard because he didn't just lose soldiers. He lost Daniel O'Connor, who wanted to be a priest, Richard Jensen, who loved farming, Marcus Antonelli, who played saxophone, Joseph Schwartz, who wrote poetry, Thomas Kim, who had survived Japanese internment camps and enlisted anyway to prove his loyalty. The other officers started to notice that King was different. After every firefight, after every casualty, King would sit alone and write. Letters to families, yes, but also in a small notebook that he carried. Captain Mitchell finally asked him about it. "What are you writing, King?" "I'm writing down their stories, sir. Everything I remember about them, so I don't forget." "King, you can't possibly forget. You remember everything." "I do, sir. But I'm afraid someday I'll forget the details. What if I forget what O'Connor's favorite hymn was? What if I forget that Jensen wanted 3 kids? What if I forget Antonelli's mother's maiden name? These men trusted me to remember them. I have to write it down. I have to make sure their stories don't die even if I do." Mitchell looked at the notebook. It was already half full. Names, dates, stories, details. King's handwriting was small and precise, cramming as much information as possible onto each page. "You're carrying them all with you," Mitchell said quietly. "Yes, sir." "That's a heavy burden, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir, but it's my burden. I chose it." In late July, during the Battle of St. Lo, King got promoted. The company commander was killed, and Captain Mitchell moved up to take his place. Mitchell made King the new commander of E Company. A company had about 180 men at full strength, divided into 4 platoons plus headquarters element. King now had to know not just his 45 men, but all 180. Most officers would have said it was impossible. You couldn't know that many men individually. But King set out to do exactly that. He spent every spare moment, and there weren't many during active combat, talking to soldiers, learning their names, their backgrounds, their stories. Through the brutal fighting in the hedgerows, through the liberation of St. Lo, through the slow advance across France, King used every lull in combat to talk to his men. Platoon leaders thought he was insane. Sergeants thought he was wasting time. But the soldiers themselves responded to it in a way nobody expected. Word spread through the company. "The new CO knows everyone." King remembered my brother's name. He asked about my wife. "He knows I'm from Montana." Men who'd been skeptical of young officers, who'd been cynical about leadership after losing their previous commander, started to believe in Robert King because he believed in them enough to remember them. By late September, after 3 months of fighting and learning, King knew all 180 men in E Company. Name, rank, hometown, family, pre-war job, hopes, fears. He could walk through the company and tell you not just who everyone was, but who mattered to them back home. Sergeant First Class Joseph Martinez from Los Angeles. His mother was Mexican. His father was a white veteran of World War I. Martinez spoke 3 languages, had worked as a translator before the war, dreamed of being a teacher. He was engaged to a woman named Rosa who worked in a defense factory. Martinez kept a picture of Rosa and a small Spanish-English dictionary in his pocket. Private First Class Robert Bobby Chen from San Francisco. His family had owned a restaurant in Chinatown before the war. Bobby had 3 younger siblings. His father had been detained briefly after Pearl Harbor because the authorities suspected all Asian Americans of being potential traitors. Bobby enlisted to prove his family's loyalty. He carried letters from his father written in Chinese that he translated for King, letters full of pride and worry. Staff Sergeant William Parker from Birmingham, Alabama. African American, assigned to one of the few integrated units. Parker had been a sharecropper's son, worked his way through high school, enlisted in 1941. Brilliant tactician, should have been an officer, but the Army's racism kept him as an NCO. Parker was married with 1 daughter. He carried a photo of his daughter on her first day of school and showed it to everyone. King remembered all of them. And in September 1944, that ability to remember saved the company's life. The Battle of the Siegfried Line, the fortified border between France and Germany, began in September 1944. The 2nd Infantry Division was tasked with breaking through the German defenses, a series of concrete bunkers, Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles, and minefields. The fighting was brutal. King's company was assigned to assault a section of the line near the German town of Aachen. The plan was simple but deadly: cross open ground under fire, breach the obstacles, assault the bunkers. Intelligence said the defenses were lightly held. Intelligence was wrong. On September 15, 1944, at 0600 hours, E Company moved out. They made it about 200 yards before the Germans opened up with machine guns and artillery. Men started dropping. King, running forward with his radio operator, saw his company getting torn apart. The air filled with smoke and screaming. Men he'd known for months were dying in front of him. That's when King's memory saved them. Most officers in that situation would have seen chaos. Individual soldiers running, taking cover, returning fire, but no coherent picture. King saw something different. As he ran forward, even with bullets cutting the air around him, his brain was tracking every single man in the company. He knew where everyone was supposed to be, and more importantly, he knew where everyone actually was. 2nd Platoon, supposed to be on the right flank, but King could see they'd gotten pinned down by a machine gun nest. He could see Sergeant Martinez's helmet, distinctive because Martinez always wore it tilted back slightly. Martinez and his squad were trapped behind a small rise. 3rd Platoon, moving up the center, but King realized they were about to walk into a minefield because he could see the slightly different color of the soil, the telltale signs that his training had taught him to spot. And 3rd Platoon's leader, Lieutenant Harris, was new, replacement officer who'd arrived just a week ago. Harris didn't know the company, didn't know the terrain, didn't know he was about to lose half his men. King made a decision. Instead of following the plan, instead of pushing straight forward like they were supposed to, he started moving. Not just directing from the rear like most company commanders, but physically running through the battlefield, using what he knew about his men to coordinate them face to face. He grabbed his radio man, Private Tommy Walsh from Philadelphia, and sprinted toward 2nd Platoon's position. Bullets snapped past his head. Walsh was breathing hard, struggling to keep up with the radio on his back. They dove behind the rise where Martinez's squad was pinned. "Martinez!" King shouted over the machine gun fire. "I can see your position. You're pinned by a gun at your 2 o'clock, about 50 yards. Martinez looked at him with wide eyes. "Captain, what the hell are you doing up here?" "Leading. Listen, Bobby Chen's squad is about 80 yards to your left. I'm going to run over there, send him around to flank that gun. When you hear him make noise, you rush it straight on. Clear?" "Sir, you can't run through this fire." But King was already moving, Walsh struggling to keep up. They zigzagged through smoke and shell craters, bullets kicking up dirt around them. King found Chen's squad taking cover behind a knocked-out German truck. "Chen!" King slid into cover next to him. "Martinez is pinned by a machine gun about 80 yards to your right. I need you to flank it, hit them from the left. Can you do it?" Bobby Chen nodded, his face set with determination. "Yes, sir. We've got a German prisoner who's willing to yell at his buddies. Might help." King's mind processed this instantly. Chen had captured a prisoner. Of course. Chen's squad had overrun a German position 10 minutes ago. Chen was smart, would have taken prisoners if he could. Perfect. Use him. Make noise. 3 minutes. King and Walsh ran back to Martinez's position, King shouting the plan over the sound of gunfire. Then he was moving again, this time toward 3rd Platoon in the center. He found Lieutenant Harris crouched behind a hedgerow, his face pale with fear. Harris's platoon was advancing steadily toward what King recognized as a minefield. King grabbed Harris's shoulder. "Stop your men, right now!" Harris jumped. "Sir, we're supposed to look at the soil ahead of you. Different color, recent digging. That's a minefield, Harris. Stop your advance or you'll lose half your men." Harris stared at the ground, then back at King. "Sir, how can you tell?" "Training and experience. Now listen. You've got a squad leader named Stefan Kowalski. Pittsburgh guy, Steel City tattoo, former coal miner. He's about 20 yards to your left. Find him. He can read terrain better than anyone in this company. He'll get you through." "Sir, I don't know who." King physically turned Harris's head. "There. See that sergeant? That's Kowalski. Now go get him and let him take point. That's an order." Harris scrambled off. King kept moving, Walsh panting behind him with the radio. For the next 20 minutes, King was everywhere, running between platoons, giving face-to-face orders, using runners when he couldn't reach positions himself. He knew Martinez was aggressive and would take risks if given the chance. He knew Chen was smart and cautious and would use every advantage. He knew Kowalski could read ground like a book. He knew Sergeant Parker could lead under pressure. He knew Private Wilson was the best shot in the company. He knew Corporal Antonelli could jury-rig any piece of equipment. And he used all of that knowledge, not from a command post, but by being there with them, running through the same fire they faced, making decisions based on what he could see and who he knew his men to be. When the Germans counterattacked, King was near 1st Platoon when their radio went out. Most commanders would have lost contact, lost control. King grabbed a runner, Private Davis from Tennessee, and sent him sprinting to battalion with the status report, then stayed with 1st Platoon and fought alongside them because he knew their platoon sergeant, Tom Brenner from Chicago, had been a ham radio operator and was probably already working on fixing the set. When a replacement soldier froze under fire, panicking and unable to move, King didn't have time for a long counseling session. He looked around, spotted Corporal Davis, who'd been a youth minister in Memphis, and physically dragged him over. "Davis, this kid needs you. Talk to him. You've got 2 minutes." Davis knew what to do because King had remembered that Davis had a gift for calming people. King was everywhere that day, running between positions, coordinating by hand signals when close enough, by runners when too far, by radio only when talking to platoon leaders. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the September cold. His lungs burned. Walsh, struggling to keep up with the radio, was ready to collapse. But they kept moving, kept coordinating, because King could see the whole battlefield in his mind like a chessboard where every piece had a name and a story. By 1800 hours, E Company had broken through the Siegfried Line. They'd taken their objective, and their casualties were far lighter than expected. 12 wounded, 2 killed. Other companies in the battalion had lost 40, 50 men. E Company had survived because their commander remembered all of them and knew how to use their individual strengths. That night, as they dug in on the German side of the fortifications, Sergeant Martinez came to find King. Martinez had a cut on his face from a near miss, and his uniform was covered in mud and blood, but he was alive. "Captain," Martinez said, "I need to tell you something." "What is it, Martinez?" "That thing you did today, knowing where everyone was, knowing what everyone could do, that's why we made it through. Chen told me you knew he'd captured a German. Harris said you knew about Kowalski's mining background. Wilson said you sent him to take out a sniper because you knew he was the best shot. Sir, how? How do you know all of us that well?" King looked at his notebook, now covered in mud and blood, filled with the names and stories of 180 men. Some of those names had lines through them, the dead and the evacuated wounded, but most were still there. "It's my job to know you, Martinez, all of you. That's what command means to me. Not just giving orders, but understanding who's receiving those orders. You're not just soldiers. You're Joseph Martinez from Los Angeles, who wants to be a teacher and marry Rosa. You're Bobby Chen from San Francisco, whose father writes him letters in Chinese. You're Stefan Kowalski from Pittsburgh, who can read terrain like his father read coal seams. You're all people with stories, and if I'm going to order you into danger, the least I can do is remember who you are." Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We'd follow you into hell, sir. You know that, right?" Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Martinez. But it did come to that 3 months later, in December 1944, in a frozen Belgian forest called the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge started on December 16, 1944, when Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, trying to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The 2nd Infantry Division was right in the path of the German attack. E Company, which had been resting in a small Belgian village, suddenly found itself fighting for survival against overwhelming German forces. King's company was ordered to hold a crossroads near a town called Krinkelt-Rocherath. The crossroads was critical. If the Germans took it, they could pour tanks and troops through and break the Allied line wide open. E Company had 165 men. They'd taken losses since September and received some replacements. They were facing an entire German regiment, maybe 2,000 men, plus panzer tanks. On the morning of December 17th, King gathered his platoon leaders and sergeants. The situation was desperate. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. Ammunition was running low. The temperature was below zero. The Germans were bringing up tanks. Most of the men hadn't slept in 2 days. "Gentlemen," King said, "I'm not going to lie to you. This is bad. We're probably going to die here." One of the newer officers, Lieutenant Morrison, spoke up. "Sir, shouldn't we retreat? Pull back to a better position?" King shook his head. "Our orders are to hold this crossroads. If we retreat, the entire division's flank is exposed. Thousands of men could die, so we stay. But I want you to understand something. Every man in this company is here for a reason. They have families, they have homes, they have futures, and I remember all of them. So when the Germans come, and they're coming, I need you to remember them too. Remember that Private Chen is doing this to prove his family's loyalty. Remember that Sergeant Martinez wants to go home to Rosa. Remember that Corporal Jensen— no, wait, Jensen got evacuated, he's safe now. Remember that Corporal Williams wants to be a doctor. Remember all of them. Because if we have to die here, at least we'll die knowing exactly who we were fighting for." The German attack came at noon. Waves of infantry supported by Panther tanks. The fighting was hellish. The temperature was below zero, the ground was frozen, and the Germans just kept coming. King moved through the defensive position, running from position to position through the frozen hell, not just giving orders but checking on specific men. He sprinted to Chen's position, bullets snapping overhead. "Chen, you okay?" "Yes, sir. We're holding." "Good." King was already moving, running 50 yards to the corner house where he knew Wilson should be. "Wilson, I need you on that corner house. 2nd floor window. Pick your shots. I need you to slow those tanks down." "On it, Captain." King ran back toward the center, nearly got hit by a mortar blast, dove into cover, and scrambled to where Martinez's squad was holding. "Martinez, your squad needs to fall back 50 yards. That building's about to collapse." "Roger, sir." King wasn't just commanding. He was remembering. He knew that Private Johnson from Oklahoma had been a mechanic and could probably fix the machine gun that had jammed. He knew that Corporal Romanowski from Detroit had worked in his father's butcher shop and had steady hands and wouldn't panic under pressure. He knew that Sergeant Thompson from Texas had grown up hunting and could estimate ranges better than anyone else in the company. And he used all of that knowledge to keep his men fighting and alive. By nightfall on December 17th, E Company had held. They'd taken heavy casualties, 35 men dead or wounded, but they'd held. The crossroads was still in American hands. The German advance had been slowed. That night, as they prepared for the next day's fighting, King did something he'd done every night of the war. He went around to every position, checking on his men, making sure they had ammunition, making sure they knew the plan. But more importantly, he reminded them that he knew who they were. He found Private Tommy Walsh, his radio operator from Philadelphia, shivering in a foxhole. Walsh was 19 years old. His hands were shaking, from cold or fear or both. "Walsh," King said, sitting down next to him in the frozen mud. "You're doing great, son." "I'm scared, sir." "I know." "I'm scared too. But you know what I remember about you, Walsh? I remember that you told me your dad runs a print shop on Market Street. I remember that you've got 3 younger brothers and a sister named Katie. I remember that you want to go to Temple University after the war and study journalism. I remember that you make jokes when you're nervous, and you sing off-key, and you're actually the best radio operator in the battalion, even though you don't think you are. I remember all of that, Walsh, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you get home to your dad's print shop and Temple University and Katie. You understand?" Walsh's hands stopped shaking. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." King moved to the next position. Sergeant Martinez was there with 3 men from his squad. "Martinez," King said. "How's Rosa?" Martinez looked up in surprise. "Sir?" "Rosa, your fiancée. You got a letter from her last week. She's working at Douglas Aircraft now, right, building C-47s. How's she doing?" Martinez smiled, despite the cold and fear. "She's good, sir. She said she's saving money for after the war. Said she wants to buy a house in Highland Park." "Good neighborhood," King said. "My uncle lived there before the war. You and Rosa will be happy there. I'll probably come visit, make sure you're treating her right." "You're serious, sir? You'd come visit after the war?" "Martinez, I remember everyone in this company. When this war is over, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you all get to live the futures you're fighting for. That includes making sure you and Rosa are happy in Highland Park. So you stay alive, and I'll stay alive, and we'll both make it to Rosa's wedding. Deal?" "Deal, sir." King made his rounds. Checked on Bobby Chen, who was writing a letter to his father in Chinese. Checked on Sergeant Parker, who was looking at a photo of his daughter. Checked on Corporal Williams, who wanted to be a doctor and was treating a wounded man with shaking hands. King knew all of them, remembered all of them, and made sure they all knew it. E Company held the crossroads for 3 days. December 17th, 18th, and 19th. The fighting was constant. The Germans threw everything at them: infantry, tanks, artillery. E Company's numbers dwindled. 165 men became 140, then 115, then 90. But they held. On the afternoon of December 19th, reinforcements finally arrived. The 2nd Infantry Division had stabilized the line. E Company was ordered to withdraw to a rear position and refit. They'd held long enough. The German advance had been stopped. King led his surviving men back through the snow. Out of 165 men, 68 were still able to walk. The rest were dead or wounded. King had lost almost 100 men in 3 days, and he remembered every single one of them. That night, in a ruined barn behind the lines, King pulled out his notebook. His hands were shaking. From exhaustion, from cold, from grief. He started writing. Every man who died in the last 3 days, their names, their stories, everything he remembered. Private Tommy Walsh from Philadelphia, killed on December 18th. Took a shell fragment to the chest while carrying a radio. Died instantly. Walsh had wanted to study journalism. His father ran a print shop. He had 3 younger brothers and a sister named Katie. He sang off-key. He made jokes when he was nervous. Sergeant Joseph Martinez from Los Angeles, wounded on December 19th, evacuated. Lost his right arm to shrapnel. Martinez would survive and return home to marry Rosa, but his dream of teaching was gone. He couldn't write on a chalkboard anymore. King would learn years later that Martinez found work and built a good life, but it wasn't the life he'd dreamed of during those cold nights in France. Private First Class Bobby Chen from San Francisco, killed on December 17th. Shot by a sniper while trying to save a wounded comrade. Chen had been writing letters to his father in Chinese. His father would never know how proud Bobby had been to serve, how hard Bobby had tried to prove his family's loyalty. King wrote for hours, filled page after page, cried while he wrote, his tears freezing on his face. Captain Mitchell found him at dawn, still writing, surrounded by the ghosts of the men he'd lost. "King," Mitchell said softly, "you need to stop. You need to sleep." "I can't stop, sir. I have to remember them. I have to write it all down. If I don't, who will? Who's going to remember that Walsh wanted to be a journalist? That Martinez loved Rosa? That Chen was trying to prove his loyalty? Who's going to remember any of them if I don't?" Mitchell sat down next to him. "You can't save them by remembering them, King. They're gone. I know they're gone. But their stories don't have to be. As long as I remember, they're not completely dead. As long as someone knows who they were, what they wanted, why they fought, they're still real. They still matter." King's voice broke. "I promised them, sir. I promised every one of them that I'd remember, that I wouldn't let them just be names on a casualty list. I have to keep that promise. It's all I can do for them now." Mitchell left him alone to write. The war lasted another 5 months after the Battle of the Bulge. King and E Company fought through Germany, across the Rhine, into the heart of the Reich. They took more casualties. King wrote down every name, every story, every detail. By April 1945, when Germany surrendered, E Company had rotated through almost 400 men. King remembered all of them. After VE Day, King was offered a promotion and encouraged to stay in the Army. He refused. He'd done his duty. He'd kept his promises. Now it was time to go home and try to live with the weight of all those memories. He went back to Indiana, finished his degree at Indiana State Teachers College, and became a history teacher at Bloomington High School South. He taught there for 34 years, from 1946 to 1980, and he did for his students what he'd done for his soldiers. He remembered them all. Every student who took his class, King learned their name, something about their family, something about their interests. He made American history personal by connecting it to their lives. When they studied World War II, and they always studied World War II in depth, King told them stories. Not generic stories from textbooks, but specific stories about specific men. When we talk about D-Day, he'd say, "I want you to understand that it wasn't just a battle. It was 180 men I knew personally, wading through the water, scared out of their minds, but moving forward anyway because they believed in something bigger than themselves." Private James Breslin from Dubuque, Iowa, he wanted to be a railroad conductor. Corporal Michael Torres from El Paso, Texas, he sang Mexican folk songs when he was homesick. These weren't just soldiers, they were people, and they did something impossible because they were willing to sacrifice for each other and for all of you, sitting here in this classroom 70 years later. King never forgot his students either. Former students would come back years later, and King would remember them. "Thompson, class of 1962, right? You were going to Ohio State to study engineering. Your dad worked at RCA. You had a girlfriend named Susan. Did you marry her?" It became legendary. People talked about Mr. King, who remembered everyone. But it wasn't just a party trick or a teaching technique. It was who he was. Robert King believed that people mattered, that their stories mattered, that remembering someone was a way of honoring them. He stayed in touch with his surviving soldiers, went to their weddings, met their children, wrote letters. When they died, and many of them died too young, from war injuries or from wounds that never healed, King went to their funerals and spoke about who they really were. He married late, at age 35, to a woman named Helen who was a librarian. They had 3 children. King remembered everything about his children's lives, every birthday, every school play, every friend's name, every story they told. His children said later that having Robert King as a father was wonderful and overwhelming because he paid such close attention, noticed everything, forgot nothing. Helen asked him once in the 1960s if he ever wished he could forget, if he ever wished his memory wasn't so perfect, so relentless. "Every day," he said honestly. "I wish I could forget what Tommy Walsh looked like when he died. I wish I could forget the sound Bobby Chen made when the bullet hit him. I wish I could forget all the pain and the fear and the death. But if I forget that, I forget them, and I can't do that. I promised I'd remember them, all of them, for the rest of my life. That's the deal I made." King retired from teaching in 1980. He spent his retirement writing. He wrote a book that was never published, a 800-page manuscript containing the biographies of every man who served in E Company during the World War II. Not a military history. A collection of stories about people. Who they were, where they came from, what they wanted, what happened to them. He sent copies to the families, to widows and children and grandchildren, and those families kept the stories and passed them down so that Tommy Walsh's grandchildren would know he wanted to be a journalist, so that Joseph Martinez's daughter would know her father loved Highland Park, so that Bobby Chen's nephews would know he fought to prove his family's loyalty. King lived to be 97 years old. In the last years of his life, his body failed, but his memory never did. Visitors said he could still recall conversations from 70 years ago, could still recite the names of every student he'd ever taught, could still describe in detail every man who'd served under him in World War II. When he died in February 2019, over 600 people came to his funeral. Sons and daughters and grandchildren of the men he'd served with, former students from 34 years of teaching, people whose lives he'd touched by simply remembering them. Detective Marcus Chen stood in the back of that church and listened to the stories, and he understood something profound. Robert King hadn't just had a good memory. He'd understood something most people never learn, that being remembered is one of the deepest human needs, that being known, really known by someone else, is what makes us feel like our lives have meaning. After the service, Chen approached Thomas Breslin, the son of Private James Breslin. "Mr. Breslin," Chen said, "can I ask you something? Your father and Lieutenant King stayed in touch after the war?" "Until my father died in 1987, Breslin said. "Mr. King came to visit every year, always on June 7th, the anniversary of D-Day. He'd sit with my dad for hours, and they'd talk about the war, about the men who didn't come home, about what it all meant. My dad said King was the best officer he ever served under because King actually cared about bringing them home. Not just completing missions, not just winning battles, but bringing James Breslin from Dubuque, Iowa, back to his family. That's what King did. He remembered that every soldier was somebody's son." Chen found another man, Gary Morrison, whose uncle had been killed in action. "Mr. Morrison, you said King came to see your mother. Why? Your uncle was dead. What could King do?" Morrison smiled sadly. He could remember, Detective. "That's what he did. He came to our house and told my mother stories about her brother, made Paul real to her again. She'd been crying for years, but she didn't have stories. She just had grief. King gave her stories, gave her a version of her brother that she could hold on to. That's a gift, Detective, to be remembered, to to have someone else carry your story when you can't carry it anymore. Chen spent the next week tracking down more people who'd known Robert King, former students, fellow veterans, family members, and the same themes emerged over and over. King remembered everyone. King made people feel important. King believed that every person's story mattered. One former student, now in her 60s, told Chen, "I had Mr. King for American history in 1971. I was a shy kid, didn't talk much, didn't think anyone noticed me. But on the first day of class, Mr. King asked us to write down something about ourselves. I wrote that I liked to read. 3 months later, he handed me a book, The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, and said, 'Susan, I remember you said you liked to read. I think you'd enjoy this.'" He remembered. Out of 150 students he taught that year, he remembered that I liked to read. That changed my life, detective. Because someone saw me. Someone remembered me. I became a teacher because of that, because I wanted to make students feel seen the way Mr. King made me feel seen. Chen went back to the funeral home and talked to King's daughter, Sarah King Novak, who was 62 and taught history at Indiana University. "Miss King Novak, your father's memory was extraordinary. Did he ever explain how it worked? How he could remember so many people?" Sarah smiled. "He said it wasn't about memory tricks or techniques. It was about caring. He said, if you actually care about someone, if you actually pay attention to who they are, you'll remember them. Most people don't remember because they don't really listen. They're thinking about themselves, about what they're going to say next. I listen. I pay attention. And then I don't forget." It was that simple to him. Care about people and you'll remember them. Did it ever burden him, remembering so much? Sarah's smile faded. Every day of his life, detective. Especially the war memories. He had nightmares until the day he died. He'd wake up screaming names. Tommy Walsh, Bobby Chen, dozens of others. Men who died under his command 70 years ago, and he was still carrying them. My mother asked him once why he didn't try to forget. Maybe see a therapist, work through the trauma. He said, "If I forget them, they disappear completely. I'm the only one left who remembers what Walsh looked like when he laughed, what Chen sounded like when he sang. If I forget, those men are truly dead, so I remember. That's my duty. That's a heavy burden. Yes, but he chose it, and I think in a strange way it gave his life meaning. He knew he couldn't save them, but he could remember them. And that was something." Chen closed his notebook. He'd written pages of notes about Robert King, about the officer who remembered everyone, about the teacher who made students feel seen, about the man who carried 300 names and stories for 75 years. That night, Chen went home and did something he'd never done before. He pulled out a notebook and started writing. Names of people he'd met over 16 years as a cop. Witnesses, victims, suspects, colleagues. People whose stories he'd heard and then forgotten because he'd moved on to the next case, the next file, the next problem. He wrote down what he could remember. It wasn't much, a few names, a few details. But he kept writing, trying to reconstruct the stories of people who'd crossed his path, people who trusted him with their worst moments, people who deserved to be remembered. 3 months later, Chen started a project. He called it Remember Them. He reached out to schools in Bloomington and offered to give talks about Robert King, about why it matters to remember people, about how paying attention to someone's story is a way of honoring their humanity. He showed students the photograph of young Lieutenant King from 1944, standing ramrod straight in his uniform, looking haunted even at 23. And he showed them the photo from 2018, a 97-year-old man surrounded by former students and soldiers' families, still remembering, still caring, still carrying all those stories. This man changed the world, Chen told the students, not by winning battles or making speeches, but by remembering people. By knowing that Private James Breslin from Dubuque, Iowa, wasn't just a soldier, he was a person with a family and dreams. By knowing that every student in his classroom had a story worth hearing. By believing that being remembered is one of the most fundamental human needs. Chen would pause and look at the students. How many of you feel like nobody really sees you? Like you're invisible? Hands would go up. Always. Because teenagers always feel unseen. Robert King saw everyone, Chen said. He remembered everyone, and because of that, hundreds of people felt like their lives mattered. That's power, kids. Not the power to control or dominate, but the power to make people feel valued. That's what King had, and you can have it too. All you have to do is pay attention, listen, care, remember. The project grew. Other teachers picked it up, other schools. By 2020, Remember Them was in 30 schools across Indiana. Students were taught to interview family members, write down their stories, preserve memories. Chen gave talks at VFW halls, teaching veterans how to record their own histories before it was too late. And at every talk, Chen told the story of Robert King, the lieutenant who remembered 180 men, the teacher who remembered thousands of students, the man who proved that the simplest act, paying attention to someone else's humanity, could change everything. 5 years after King's death, Chen got a letter from Thomas Breslin. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a young soldier standing next to a young officer on a beach in Normandy, June 1944. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, Private J. Breslin and Latar King, Omaha Beach, D+1. King knew my name before we landed. That's why I'm alive. The letter read, Detective Chen, my father died in 1987, but before he did, he told me something. He said that on D-Day, when he was most scared, Lieutenant King came up to him and knew his name, knew his family, knew his dreams. That moment of being seen, of being known, gave my father the courage to go forward. It's not an exaggeration to say that Robert King's memory saved my father's life, and by extension, saved mine, because I wouldn't exist if my father had frozen on that beach. I wanted you to have this photograph. It's the only picture I have of my father with Lieutenant King. I think it belongs with your project so that people can see what it looks like when someone really sees you. When someone remembers you, that's what King gave my father. That's what he gave all of them. The gift of being known. Thank you for keeping his story alive. Thomas Breslin. Chen framed the photograph, put it in his office, and every time he looked at it, he saw 2 young men on a beach in France, one scared and one determined, connected by the simple act of remembering. Private Breslin and Lieutenant King. The soldier and the officer who knew his name. That's the story of Robert King. Not the hero who won battles, though he did. Not the teacher who educated thousands, though he did. But the man who remembered, who understood that every person has a story, and that hearing that story, holding that story, honoring that story is one of the most important things any of us can do. E Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, had 397 men serve in it between June 1944 and May 1945. 114 were killed in action. 203 were wounded. 80 made it through without physical injury, though all of them carried wounds that never healed. Robert King remembered all 397 names, wrote down all 397 stories, and spent 75 years making sure those stories didn't die with the men who lived them. At his funeral in February 2019, They read a letter King had written to be opened after his death. It was short. To everyone reading this, I spent my life trying to remember people. Not because I had a special gift, but because I believed every person deserves to be known. To the men I served with, thank you for letting me remember you. To the students I taught, thank you for letting me know you. To my family, thank you for understanding why I had to carry all these stories. I made a promise in 1944 that I would remember the men who served under me. I kept that promise. Now, I ask you to remember them too. Tell their stories, say their names, keep them alive in your memory. Because that's all any of us really want, to be remembered, to have mattered, to have been seen. Remember them. Remember all of them. Robert Allen King, Lieutenant, U.S. Army, 1944-1945. Teacher, 1946-1980. Human being who paid attention, 1921-2019. 600 people at a funeral in Bloomington, Indiana. All there because one man remembered them, or remembered someone they loved, or understood that being remembered is what makes us human. That's the real story. Not about battles or medals or glory. About a man who knew 180 names and never forgot a single one. About the power of paying attention. About how the simplest gift, remembering someone's story, can echo across generations. Detective Marcus Chen still runs the Remember Them project, still tells the story of Lieutenant Robert King to students across Indiana, still keeps that photograph of Private Breslin and Lieutenant King on Omaha Beach, D+1, June 1944. Because some stories matter too much to forget, and Robert King taught us that every story matters. Every person deserves to be remembered. Every life has meaning. All you have to do is pay attention. All you have to do is remember.